The gunslinger's recognition. The autumn wind carried dust and the scent of sagebrush through the crooked streets of Perdition, a town that lived up to its name in every weathered plank and broken promise. Jacob Calloway pulled his hat low as he dismounted from his weary horse, spurs jingling against the hitching post with a sound like distant church bells, though there hadn't been a church in Perdition for nigh on 5 years now. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood before him, its paint peeling like old skin, windows clouded with grime and broken dreams. Jacob had ridden hard for 3 days, fleeing the aftermath of a job gone wrong in Tucson, and his pockets held enough coin for a bottle, a bed, and perhaps some company to help him forget the faces of the men he'd killed. At 32, Jacob had the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much and done worse. His dark hair, once the color of rich soil, now showed streaks of premature gray at the temples. A scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a memento from a knife fight in El Paso, and his green eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd lost his soul somewhere between the first kill and the last. He pushed through the batwing doors, and the familiar smell of whiskey, tobacco, and desperation washed over him. The saloon was half empty, populated by the usual collection of drifters, cowboys, and broken men who found themselves in places like Perdition when they had nowhere else to go. "Whiskey," Jacob said to the bartender, a grizzled man with arms like tree trunks, and a face that suggested he'd seen every kind of trouble a man could imagine. "Good stuff or the rot gut?" the bartender asked, already reaching for a bottle. "Surprise me," Jacob replied, laying a silver dollar on the scarred wooden bar. As he drank, Jacob became aware of the women moving through the crowd, soiled doves. They called them in polite company, though there wasn't much polite about Perdition. They wore faded dresses that might have been colorful once, their faces painted with rouge and powder that couldn't quite hide the hardness in their eyes. One approached him as he finished his second whiskey. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and skin pale as morning cream. There was something different about her, a quality that set her apart from the other women in the establishment. She carried herself with a dignity that seemed out of place in such surroundings. "Evening, stranger," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You look like a man who's traveled far." Jacob studied her face in the dim light. Something stirred in his memory, like a moth beating against a window, but he couldn't place it. "Far enough," he said. "You got a name?" "Rose," she said simply. "Rose McKinnon." The name meant nothing to him, though something about her manner suggested it should. "Well, Rose McKinnon, I reckon I could use some company tonight. What's your price?" $5, she said without hesitation. "For the whole night." It was steep, but Jacob had money to burn and a need to forget that ran deeper than his pocket. He nodded and followed her up the narrow stairs to the second floor, past rooms where other transactions were taking place behind thin walls that barely muffled the sounds within. Rose's room was cleaner than he'd expected, with a real window that looked out onto the main street and a bed that appeared to have actual sheets. She lit an oil lamp that cast warm shadows on the walls, then turned to face him. "You can put your gun on the dresser," she said. "I don't allow weapons in my bed." Jacob hesitated. He'd survived this long by never being more than an arm's length from his Colt, but something in her manner suggested she could be trusted. He unbuckled his gun belt and laid it carefully on the wooden dresser, the weight of the weapon familiar as his own heartbeat. "You're not from around here," Rose observed, as she began to unlace her dress. "Your accent, Texas." "Born there," Jacob admitted. "But I haven't been back in 15 years or more." Rose paused in her unlacing. 15 years is a long time to be away from home. "Sometimes a man doesn't have a choice," Jacob said, settling into the room's single chair. "Sometimes home stops being home." As Rose continued to undress, Jacob found himself studying her face more carefully. The lamplight revealed features that tugged at his memory with increasing insistence. The shape of her nose, the way she held her head, the particular shade of her auburn hair, all of it familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "Rose," he said suddenly, "what was your name before McKinnon?" She froze, her dress half unlaced. "Why do you ask?" "You remind me of someone I used to know. A long time ago." Rose turned to face him, fully, and in the lamplight, Jacob saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. Recognition, fear, and something else, a sorrow so deep it seemed to have weight. "What was your name?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before you came to this place." For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, in a voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it, she said, "Calloway, Rose Calloway." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jacob felt as though he'd been kicked in the chest by a mule. All the air driven from his lungs in a single devastating blow. He stared at her face, really looked at it for the first time, and saw past the paint and powder to the features beneath. The high cheekbones inherited from their mother, the stubborn set of the jaw that came from their father, the green eyes that were identical to his own. "No," he whispered. "No. It can't be." But even as he said it, he knew it was true. The sister he'd lost, the family torn apart by tragedy and circumstance, stood before him in a brothel in Perdition, Nevada, dressed in faded silk and selling her body to strangers. "Jacob," she said, and her voice broke on his name. "Is it really you?" He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. 15 years collapsed in an instant, and he was 12 years old again, watching their farmhouse burn while Apache raiders disappeared into the night with his parents' bodies still warm in the ash. He remembered searching frantically for Rose, calling her name until his voice was raw, finding only her torn dress caught on a fence post and assuming the worst. "I thought you were dead," he finally managed. "I looked for you. I looked everywhere." "Rose." His sister wrapped her arms around herself as if she were cold. "They took me," she said. "The Apache kept me for 2 years before I escaped. By then, there was nowhere to go, no family to return to. I made my way north, did what I had to do to survive." Rose. Her name was a prayer on his lips, an absolution for sins he'd carried for 15 years. "I'm so sorry. I should have found you. I should have. You were just a boy," she said, tears streaming down her painted cheeks. "What could you have done?" Jacob stood on unsteady legs, every fiber of his being screaming at the wrongness of the situation. He'd come here seeking comfort in the arms of a stranger, only to discover that the stranger was the person he'd spent half his life mourning. "We have to leave," he said suddenly. "You can't stay here, not anymore." Rose let out a bitter laugh. "And go where, Jacob? What life is there for a woman like me? I've been in this business for 12 years. It's all I know. I have money," Jacob said desperately. "We could go somewhere new. Start over. You could use a different name." "Like you have?" Rose asked, and there was steel in her voice now. "Tell me, brother, what have you been doing these 15 years? What kind of man have you become?" Jacob felt the weight of his gun belt on the dresser, the ghosts of every man he'd killed whispering in his ears. "I'm a gunfighter," he said quietly. "A killer for hire. I've done things, terrible things." "Then we're both damned, aren't we, Rose?" "Both survivors who did what we had to do to keep breathing." They stood facing each other in the lamplight, two broken pieces of a family that had been shattered so long ago. Jacob saw in his sister's face the same haunted quality he recognized in his own mirror each morning. The look of someone who'd traded pieces of their soul for the simple privilege of staying alive. "There has to be a way out," Jacob said. "For both of." Rose moved to the window and looked out at the street below where drunken cowboys stumbled between saloons and the promise of violence hung in the air like smoke. "I used to think that," she said. "When I was younger, I used to dream about escape, about finding you, about us putting our family back together. But dreams don't pay for food or shelter. Dreams don't keep you alive when winter comes and you've got nowhere else to go." Jacob joined her at the window. Outside, Perdition carried on its nightly ritual of sin and sorrow, oblivious to the reunion taking place in the room above. "I've got a horse," he said. "Some money. We could ride out tonight." "And then what?" Rose asked. "You think any decent town would have us? A known gunfighter and a horse? We'd be run out before we could water our horses." "Then we'll find an indecent town," Jacob said with grim humor. "Shouldn't be too hard in this territory." For the first time since the recognition had dawned, Rose almost smiled. "You always were stubborn," she said. "Even as a boy, you never knew when to quit." "Maybe that's why I'm still alive," Jacob said. "Maybe that's why we both are." They talked through the night, sharing the stories of their separate survival. Rose told him about her years with the Apache, how she'd learned their language and customs, how she'd eventually earned enough trust to escape during a raid on a Mexican settlement. She spoke of the long journey north, the succession of towns and jobs that had gradually worn away her hope until she'd found herself in Perdition, selling the only thing she had left to sell. Jacob in turn told her about his own descent into violence, how he'd learned to shoot from an old buffalo hunter in a Baleine, how he'd killed his first man in self-defense at 16, how each subsequent killing had become easier until he no longer felt anything at all when he pulled the trigger. "Do you ever think about them?" Rose asked, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. "Our parents? Every day," Jacob admitted. "I wonder what they'd think of what we've become." "They'd think we survived," Rose said firmly, "in a world that tried its hardest to kill us." We survived. That has to count for something. As the sun rose over perdition, Jacob made a decision that surprised even him. I'm done, he said. With all of it. The killing. The running. The emptiness. I want to try to be better. Rose looked at him with eyes that held the first glimmer of hope he'd seen in them. It won't be easy, she said. Changing what we are. No, Jacob agreed. But maybe we don't have to do it alone anymore. They left perdition that morning. Two damaged souls seeking redemption in a world that had shown them precious little mercy. Jacob sold his gun to a young cowboy who thought he looked tough, keeping only enough firepower to protect them on the road. Rose gathered her few possessions, leaving behind the life that had sustained her but never truly been hers. They rode west toward California, where the gold rush had created new towns full of people too busy building fortunes to ask too many questions about the past. Along the way they began the slow, difficult work of healing. Not just their own wounds but the bond between them that had been severed so brutally years before. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Rose struggled with nightmares and memories that wouldn't fade. Jacob found that putting down his guns was easier than putting down the habits of violence that had kept him alive for so long. There were days when they both wondered if they'd made a mistake, if the devil they knew wasn't better than the uncertain angel they were chasing. But they had each other, and that was something neither had possessed for 15 long years. They were family, scarred, broken, but family nonetheless. And in a world that had taken so much from them, that was everything. In Sacramento, Rose found work as a seamstress, her nimble fingers proving as skilled with needle and thread as they'd once been with other, sadder trades. Jacob took a job as a blacksmith's apprentice, learning to create rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down. They lived in a small boarding house, Jacob taking the name James Carson, and Rose calling herself Ruth Carson, siblings who'd come west to start fresh after losing their farm to drought back in Texas. The lie came easily, perhaps too easily, but it gave them the respectability they needed to build new lives, and slowly, painfully, they began to heal. On Sundays they would walk to the outskirts of town and sit by a small creek that reminded them of the one that had run behind their childhood home. They would talk about their parents, sharing memories that had grown precious with time and loss. They spoke of their father's booming laugh and their mother's gentle hands, of harvest festivals, and Christmas mornings that seemed to belong to different people entirely. Do you think they'd forgive us? Rose asked one afternoon as they watched the water flow past. For what we be? Jacob considered the question seriously. I think they'd understand, he said finally. I think they'd be glad we found each other again. As the months passed, they began to build something that resembled a normal life. Rose made friends among the other seamstresses, women who admired her skill and never questioned her past. Jacob earned the respect of his employer and fellow workers through honest labor and quiet reliability. They attended church, not from sudden religiosity but because it was what respectable people did, and they were determined to become respectable. It wasn't always easy. Jacob still woke sometimes in the middle of the night reaching for guns that were no longer there, his dreams filled with the faces of men he'd killed. Rose battled her own demons, memories of things that had been done to her and things she'd been forced to do, but they faced these struggles together, and that made all the difference. 2 years after leaving perdition, Jacob, now James Carson, stood in his sister's small parlor, watching her put the finishing touches on a wedding dress for the mayor's daughter. Rose had built a reputation as the finest seamstress in Sacramento, and her waiting list stretched for months. You're happy, he observed, and it wasn't a question. Rose, now Ruth, looked up from her work and smiled. It was a real smile, the first he'd seen from her since childhood. I am, she said. Are you? Jacob nodded. He'd been asked to become a partner in the blacksmith shop, and there was talk of him courting the banker's widow, a kind woman named Eleanor, who appreciated his quiet strength and never pressed him about his past. Sometimes I wonder if this is all a dream, Rose said, setting down her needle. If I'll wake up back in that room in perdition. It's not a dream, Jacob said firmly. This is real. We're real, and we deserve this chance. That evening, as they sat on the porch of the boarding house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rose took her brother's hand, scarred from years of violence, now marked by honest labor, and squeezed it gently. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For not walking away, for not being ashamed of what I was. Jacob turned to look at his sister, really look at her. The paint and powder were long gone, replaced by the natural beauty that had been hidden beneath. The haunted look in her green eyes had faded, replaced by something that might actually be called peace. You're my sister, he said simply. Nothing could ever change that. Nothing could ever make me ashamed of you. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, they sat in comfortable silence,
Two survivors who had found their way back to each other, and in doing so had found their way back to themselves. The road ahead was uncertain. It always was, but they would travel it together. In Perdition, the Silver Dollar Saloon still stood, still serving rotgut whiskey to broken men and hosting transactions between the desperate and the damned. But the room on the second floor, where a gunslinger had discovered his long-lost sister, remained empty, a testament to the possibility of redemption even in the darkest of places. Jacob and Rose Calloway were gone, but James and Ruth Carson lived on, proof that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to build a different future. They'd paid a terrible price for their survival, but in the end, they'd found something more valuable than the lives they'd lost. They'd found each other, and in that finding they'd discovered that home wasn't a place but a person, and family wasn't blood but choice. The gunslinger had hung up his guns, the soiled dove had found her wings, and together they'd learned that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to reach for it, even in a place called Perdition.